Fear Collective, what's up? I'm Ethan, and let's get into the scares and subtext of Wes Craven's 1977, The Hills Have Eyes. Wes Craven. He is now known as a horror heavyweight, but he wasn't always regarded in such high esteem. In 1972, he debuted The Last House on the Left, which essentially turned the horror genre on its severed head because it was so violent and bombastic and confident and weird and very different from what we were seeing from horror in the 60s with films like Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby and Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. Those films were made by auteurs. They were highbrow, high concept. They were horror films, but they had something to say, and they were done in a very meticulous, artistic way. The Last House on the Left was an exploitation film, a smut film, and a mainstream film. And the idea that you can put those three together really offended many audiences. And, some people loved it and a lot of people hated it. But it definitely let America know that Wes Craven was a filmmaker who wasn't afraid to try something new and say what he had to say in an interesting, innovative, new way that was very much a departure from what filmmakers were doing in horror and in film in general. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out shortly after The Last House on the Left in 1974 and was very much in that same kind of exploitation style tone. It was not bloody at all, but incredibly grimy, and it terrorized audiences. And suddenly there was a mainstream market for these types of films. And that's exactly why Wes Craven made 1977's The Hills Have Eyes. Originally, he wasn't wanting to do another horror film, but he's gone on record to say that this film was essentially a cash grab for him. But I still feel that he managed to say some really interesting things with this film and scare people simultaneously, and essentially establish himself as a horror filmmaker to watch. So I reviewed the 2006 remake from Alexandre Aja before I actually sat down and watched this film. And to be honest, I did not even realize just how similarly structured the remake was to this film, even right down to the character dialogue. And while I can't say that made me like the remake any less, it definitely made me appreciate the original all that much more. And I thought that the changes that they made, or the updates that they made in the remake, said something quite interesting about the climate and the culture in which these films exist. So if you look at the original, the backstory for the mutant family desert dwellers is simply that a gas station attendant had a son who was violent and a recluse, essentially, and he left him out in the desert to die. And reading into kind of the time frame at which this film was made, it was in the wake of the Vietnam War. And essentially, America was shipping young men off to die overseas in a war that a lot of people had a lot of anger about. And so how fitting that in this film, the gas station attendant kind of left his son to die in the desert, only to be, tormented by the guilt of that action for years and years and years. That whole idea seemed less relevant in 2006, and so that backstory was replaced with a government conspiracy, nuclear testing situation that led to crazy, gnarly radiation poisoning that ultimately deformed our mutant family and served as a catalyst for their revenge. And if you think back to the 2000s, there was an ever growing distrust of the government. There was a lot of anger about the terrorist attacks and how our government responded to that. And so the idea of this government conspiracy was accessible to a wide variety of Americans. And I think that's why it was used in the remake. There was this huge distrust of the government, and that feeds directly into the narrative that a government conspiracy destroys the nuclear family, and it's masterminded by an all-powerful, corrupt government. So it's been reported that Wes Craven wanted to comment on the morality of savagery, essentially. And so when watching the original, we're meant to fear the desert dwellers because of their violence and their brutality. And yet at the end of the film, the family that we're following and rooting for act in equally violent and brutal ways, and yet we cheer them. So the idea that we're cheering one of our own for the same violent acts for which we fear the other essentially defines this film. One thing that I picked up on in my watching of this film was that the older characters seem to die really brutal, gnarly deaths. The mother and the father, the patriarch, the establishment, they meet their end. And it's really the ingenuity and the tenacity of our younger characters that ultimately defeats evil and saves the day. And I thought what an interesting reflection of the filmmaking landscape of the 70s, where we have young new filmmakers like Wes Craven and Tobe Hooper doing really interesting, innovative things with their filmmaking, saying interesting things in a very different way, where kind of these old Hollywood, Alfred Hitchcock established ideas about filmmaking, ways of filmmaking, kind of figuratively die off. Maybe Wes Craven was saying with this film that, the establishment is done and it's time for a new era. It's time for youthful ideas. It's time for ingenuity. Or maybe he didn't, I don't know, but that was my reading of it. So I'm gonna rate The Hills Have Eyes a 7 out of 10 on the scare scale, primarily because of the nighttime camper scene where the family's attacked and the mother's attacked. I thought it was just incredibly harrowing, and it felt very much like an exploitation film, where you're there watching the violence very matter-of-factly, and nothing is gratuitous. Nothing feels Hollywood about it. It all feels very realistic and cold, and that was incredibly chilling, and it really stuck with me. I'm going to rate The Hills Have Eyes a 9 out of 10 on the impact scale, because I think this film really, really did great things for the horror genre and is still effective all of these years later. I can totally see this film influencing movies like Wolf Creek, which I reviewed for the channel, and Joyride. Wrong Turn, I think, is entirely indebted to this film, and of course the other Hills Have Eyes sequels. And this is definitely going to be a buy for me, and I would recommend purchasing it if you are a fan of collecting the horror classics. To be honest, the classics are something that I had to kind of grow into. My taste had to grow into it, because when I originally watched these films, I was like, I don't know, they're old. I couldn't get into the characters' behaviors because it's very different from how we act now, how we talk now. But when you kind of put yourself in the time period and really contextualize the movie with what was going on in the world around the films, I kind of grew to understand them better and have a greater appreciation for them. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I really enjoyed doing a deep dive into this film, and if you're a fan of horror movie analysis, then stick around because I have a lot more where this came from.